Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, a Cadence independent media production. Today we are doing bop tuning, jazz tuning, whatever you want to call it. Small drums tuned up pretty high. All right, here we go. And thanks again to our presenting sponsor, ProMark by D'Addario, for helping out here. I'm doing SD2s today, which is actually the stick I like to use for jazz, even though it is pretty big. It gives a really great cymbal sound, and it helps to make these kind of high-pitched drums speak to my ear. So here's what we're doing today. We have my jazz kit, which is from Precision Drum Company. It is thin maple shells in totally standard sizes, 12 by 8, 14 by 14, 14 by 18. And the head makeup is also what I've been using for jazz and for just general like small group stuff, even some like backbeat music and folk things, which is Calftones on top of the batters. We have G1s on the bottoms coated, and then the bass drum has these G12 heads that we were demonstrating in the last couple of videos. I also brought my Noble and Cooley snare today just because I'm feeling fancy because I put new hoops on it and I wanted to play it. And it also has a Calftone on the batter as well. So we have a sort of like-minded vibe along here with the addition of these G12s on the bass drum. I really love this sort of drum sound, and it was also something that took me a while to get used to because I came from rock music and pop music and just things that I heard on the radio. And even listening to older jazz recordings, a lot of times they're minimally mic'd and there's kind of a lot of room sound, so you don't necessarily hear how high the drums are tuned, but you hear that they're articulate and that when they play really fast stuff or when they play around the kit, you can really hear everything and there's not a lot of low end filling up the space, which would be a problem for the upright bass and can also be a problem for the lower end of the piano. So what ends up happening is you have to figure out a way to get tone out of the drum, but articulation at the same time, and ultimately kind of a shorter sound. Now, there are lots of little additions that you can do to your kit to sort of help with this. For instance, a lot of the old recordings are Gretsch drums, which pretty much always featured die-cast hoops, and a lot of what I think of as the sort of Gretsch sound in jazz has to do with die-cast hoops on the toms. Because of the way that it really puts a point on the sound and really focuses the sound. And for my money, it's a little bit punchier at the high tunings. Lower tunings, it's not as different. Then the second thing is using suspension mounts for an older kind of straight ahead bop sound may give you a little bit of grief with the amount of sustain you're going to have at any given tuning, where those sounds that we're used to hearing, whether it's Art Blakey or Tony Williams, any of those guys, they were not hanging the drums. They were just on a standard mount, or the rack was on a snare stand. And that also adds to sort of a shorter, punchier sound. Now, I've heard in interviews and in other places from a lot of the sort of old original dudes like Max Roach and Roy Haynes, those sorts of guys, that they would think in terms of jazz tuning as the smaller the group, the higher you tune, and the larger the group, the lower you tune. So big band drums are tuned a little lower. Not like rock, but they're lower, and the kick drum is sometimes a 20, and it can be in bop too. And then as the group gets smaller, the drums get pitched higher because you're trying to integrate and take up less space so that everything can mix together in that little group and you can hear everything, because there's a lot more subtlety than when you have a horn section and maybe piano and guitar, and you kind of have to come up from below with your sound in that situation. And with bop, the bass drum might actually be above the bass in terms of where the low end of it is sitting. Now, these drums aren't just tuned high. There's actually kind of a specific way that I tune them for this kind of thing, and it's actually not that different than the way we talked about tuning in the pop video. The main difference is that the interval is flipped. So the batter head is the higher of the two, and then you have some kind of interval between them where the lower head, the resonant head, is actually a little bit lower. I know straight from someone who teched for Tony Williams, especially in the 80s when he had the big Gretsch kit, that he was doing black dot heads on both sides, and the bottom heads were tuned so low that sometimes they fell off in the cases when they were traveling with the drums. And that was basically two reasons. One is Tony played really hard in that era, and the other is that he needed the drum sound to be fairly short, like not like a concert tom, but almost like a concert tom, because he was trying to tell a story with those drums, and if they were starting to kind of wash over each other, some of that would get lost. And when you're dealing with acoustic instruments that aren't necessarily close mic'd in a big hall, it's the same as a classical snare drum. Articulation where you are leads to a great sound out in the hall after the room has added to it. So right now with these drums, I am somewhere between like a whole step and a third between the two heads. And again, the Reso head is lower. The point of this is just to get more stick articulation on the top of the drum. And when we're talking about articulation, I'm really talking about the physical sensation of hitting that head, and that you feel a clean touch on that head from really quiet to hitting it really loud. Now, if you have a super low tuned drum and you play it really soft and it feels kind of pillowy, that sound is not making it to the band or the audience really. And with this kind of thing, where maybe the volume thresholds are also a lot lower, you might need to be playing an inch or 2 inches off the head and have the thing you're doing be audible so that it can matter in the context of the song. And it's also true of the snare drum. It's to a degree true with the bass drum as well. If you're thinking about feathering, playing very softly, or if you're thinking about just comping and playing material with that drum, but that's maybe underneath an unmiked piano, or I mean sometimes an unmiked singer, which is extra ridiculous, but it's a thing that happens sometimes with this sort of music. Additionally, higher tuned drums have great brush response because of the tension. The sound of the lateral motions is a little clearer and a little more articulate. And mallets as well. With mallets, it can get a little bit pitchy, which can sometimes kind of rub the wrong way with the song you might be playing if it doesn't match the key. But again, we're going for mostly articulation and not like a long sound. So the hope is that we're getting a good tone that's almost gated because of the way that we're tuning these drums, so that if we want to play really fast stuff, it's all clear. And if we want to play slower things, basically we just really need to have our phrasing together, because it also will bring out any discrepancies in your phrasing or your time that may exist that you don't know are there because of your normal tuning. Let's give a little listen to these drums on their own. I'm going to kind of play each head individually, and then I'll play on the drum itself so you can hear how they're working together to make the sound. So as you can sort of hear from that, I tried to be dynamic and not super dense with all of that stuff so that you can hear that there's still real clarity in the stuff when it gets really low to the head. And there's also still a full sound when you hit it really hard. The sensation of playing high-tuned drums, especially ones where the batter head is a little lower, takes some getting used to because they do, compared to like pop tuning, it feels a little boxy and it feels like a lot more rebound than you'd expect. But you'll find if you're going to be using a lot of different implements and like things like mallets, or if you're going to actually be doing like rolls, like real rolls on the toms, or like diddle rudiments, all that kind of stuff, the higher you tune them, the easier that stuff is to do, which I think is also why this is a nice opportunity to work on that kind of thing, because you can really tell a different kind of story with your playing, and you can tell it at a much lower volume in a way that carries. So now let's talk about extremes for jazz tuning. I'm going to leave the bass drum where it is. I might pitch it down a little bit, but this first one, I'm going to lower the toms into, I guess, what I would call more of like a big band range. But the thing is, it's not a lot lower. It's just a little bit lower. And the only real reason for this is that when you're in a large ensemble like that, there's a lot of other stuff in your frequency range. And that means that a little more low-end presence in the drums will throw the tone of the drum further. And again, this is opinion. This is my experience. But this has been what was functional for me when I did these types of things. And comparatively, if I did that lower, bigger tuning in a trio, it would be a little harder to control. It'd be a little bit trickier to feel like I could interact without making just like a ton of sound and getting in the way. And when you're dealing with music where the ceiling of the volume threshold is not very high, you do have to be careful about that kind of thing. So here we go. We're going to start with the rack tom. It's worth noting that I only did about an eighth of a turn. It wasn't even like a quarter turn. And now the batter head is underneath, pitch-wise, of where the Reso was for the last tuning. Little increments, huge difference. Now we're going to do the same approach on the floor tom. Oh, but before we do that, just a little reminder, based on people asking, demand, we have t-shirts and hoodies down in our merch department directly below this video. So please have a look and grab one if you want to and kind of help represent. And thanks very much. So this is a super cool tuning. It also reminds me of Billy Martin and some other kind of like avant-garde guys that are doing like backbeat music, but that tune their drums this way. And hopefully you can kind of hear how like this sort of tuning comes from a time when drums were either barely mic'd or not mic'd at all, and had to speak with articulation at a pretty serious distance, like if the audience is out dancing or if it's in a hall or something like that. Even at this somewhat lower tuning, you can sort of hear how there's still clarity when you're getting down low to the drum. And if you're going to be doing a solo, or if you're going to be accompanying a group where everyone needs to hear this stuff in order to be synced up, it's really effective. It works really well. And I lowered the bass drum, the batter head, just like a tiny bit, just so that it was slightly different for this one. But none of these are hard and fast rules. I just do kind of adhere to the notion that having the batter a little higher really helps to capture that kind of sound back then. Clearly from this, the articulation is in the batter head, and then we can help with it by adjusting the bottom head. Now, if we were to boost up the bottom heads above, we would get a lot more sustain and a lot more bloom in the note in both of these. And you can try it if you want to, set up like the way that we did, and then just try tuning up the bottom head a little bit more and see what happens, because it'll definitely make a totally cool and usable sound, but it will sound a little more modern, to me anyway, and likely to your ears as well. That's also an adjustment you can make in terms of the feel of the drum, like how it feels to hit it, because if the bottom head is above the batter, the actual physical sensation of hitting the drum is, again, totally different. It's going to make the low stuff different, the rim shots, everything is going to be a really different sensation. All right, chapter 3, super duper high. 40s bebop, Max Roach in particular, extremely high tuned drums. A lot of Tony's early stuff also super high. To hear him tell it, he did it because Max Roach did it. And I had a professor in college who played with these guys back in the day, and he told me when he was watching me tune drums, he said, "Would you like to know how Max Roach tuned drums?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Max said to me, tune the drum as high as it will go, and then it is in tune." That's secondhand information, but he said that he said it to him directly, so I'm saying it to you now. That's one way to do it. It might have something to do with calf heads, because it was the 40s after all, and earlier in some cases. So we're not going to tune it as high as it'll go, but we're going to tune it real high. Now we're going to do the same approach on the floor tom. All right, these are tuned stupid high, and we're going to demo them a little bit and see what they do. That's a crazy sound. And it's it definitely sounds like I remember those records sounding. It feels super strange to play toms that are tuned that high, and it feels super strange to hear them like right on the edge of choking out. Like the floor tom is definitely dicey at best at that tension. It's a little easier to tune shallow drums this high because of how close together the heads are. With a square, like a normal size floor tom, super high tunings, not all drums will do it really well. And it sounds kind of crazy where you're sitting. I think it's almost one of those things that's maybe better where the audience is than where you are, which is also a little bit hard to get with. I also tuned the snare up a little bit for that one because once we got the toms where they were going, the rack tom was a lot higher than the snare was before, which already sounded pretty high to me. Again, totally player preference, totally exploratory, see what you like kind of stuff. It's super fascinating to see the physics of it though, and seeing like how high can you really tune a head, and what do you have to do to the other head to make that height of tuning on the batter functional? Because if you're not in a good range to get them to kind of work together and make the tone, it just sounds dead. Like it sounds like that there's something wrong with the head or something wrong with the drum, especially when you get way up in the stratosphere like that. But also, like, don't forget, I mean, like Mike Clark with the Headhunters, he tuned his drums crazy high. Like I'm thinking about like the record Survival of the Fittest, for instance, or some of the live stuff where he's playing funk music and his drums are cranked. But that was the first time that I heard anybody sort of cross over that extremely into kind of backbeat-oriented music with the stuff tuned up super high. And again, there are other people that are sort of adhere to kind of more of a jazz tuning, playing stuff that isn't jazz, and don't be afraid to try that out, especially if it's your band. Or at least if you're like high in the hierarchy of your band and can make judgment calls about stuff like that. So basically, to sum up, it's really fun to do extreme tunings with your drums. Bop stuff isn't really an extreme tuning in and of itself, but some bop music is tuned extremely high, and some big band music is tuned surprisingly low. So don't be afraid to experiment with it, and don't be afraid to flip the script on intervals with your toms and pitch the batter a little higher and the reso a little lower just to see what it does for you. If you want to get into playing rim shots on your toms or emulating different kinds of like Latin drumming and African drumming with them, it's a big boost for that. It's super fun. Go out and check out music where people tune their drums this way and see what it sounds like in person. Lots of people do it, not just in New York, it's all over the place. And I guess that's about it. Just it's a fun way to mess with your drums. The sizes of your drums don't matter. You can do it on anything and just kind of see what happens. And it's super fun. Thanks also again to our presenting sponsor, ProMark by D'Addario, for helping out with all of this and keeping us in sticks. And yeah, let us know if you play bop and what you think about this. One thing we didn't touch on today that I don't think too much is the actual interval between the two toms. I basically try to be around a fourth, but I know some people like bigger extremes and some people like smaller extremes. There's no right way. And yeah, if you have thoughts about this, let us know.